we are now going into our panel discussion, which is really the highlight of this, and that is, of course, ethical considerations when it comes to AI in healthcare. That is something everybody thinks about, and that is something we need to bring out into the light and discuss openly. So, as a moderator for the panel, we have our own Martin Holm, which is heading our AI department in iLab. Welcome.
Yes, thank you, Christian. And it's quite exciting to see so many people here. You all look wonderful. The title of the panel is The Implications of Black Box Models for Patients. We will get into what this black box analogy is useful for. Explainability, ethics, and democracy, because when we're talking about things that affect people's lives, and you've just seen 30 minutes of how important this is, and how much it affects their quality of life, these considerations come up. We have 3 amazing panelists for you, so if you would join the stage, and I will be introducing you. First is Thomas Bolander. Thomas is an associate professor at DTU. He's a member of the Siri Commission, which studies the impact of AI on society. He frequently guests Danish media. His greatest achievement, I think, was that he was also my Ph.D. supervisor.
Yeah, that's true.
So
look what I achieved through you.
Thank you for coming, Thomas.
You're welcome. Jeg tror, jeg skal sidde her. Eller nej, det er dig.
Next, we have Birkjaer from the Happiness Research Institute. Michael. You'll have to excuse the panel. We're all native Danish speakers, so our English will sometimes be a bit broken. Michael, as I said, works at the Happiness Research Institute, but has also collaborated here in Leo Innovation Lab with the So Happy project, studying the impact of chronic skin conditions and happiness. And he is representing the patient perspective here, in that he has studied it at the macro level, at the statistical level. So thank you so much for coming, Michael.
Thank you.
And last up is Lisbeth Bech Poulsen from the Socialist People's Party. She's been a member of the Danish Parliament since 2011. Very recently, she co-authored the book Oprør for Fremtiden. I went and used, because this is an AI talk, I went to Google Translate and figure out what they translated with. That came out as Rebel for the Future, which is more like a punk rock song than a statement, I think. I don't know exactly how to translate it into English. It's not my job, but I would maybe say a revolt for the future or something. A translation like that is more in order. Thank you for wanting to participate. Lisbeth?
Thank you.
I think I need someone to unlock the slides. Could that be? Or can I use this? Sorry for that. There we go. These are our awesome panelists. We've tried to structure it into 3 sections. First, we'll talk about AI in the regulatory space. How should that look like? What is it today? And also a bit on why does this really matter? We've already heard on how this impacts people's lives. Then we'll look at the conditions under which we actually start to use these models, these black box models in, so to speak, production, out in the real world where it matters. And at the end, we're going to look to the future. Where's this going to take us? How can we get there? Are we getting there fast enough? What do we need to look out for? So let me set the scene for the first bit, AI in the regulatory space. So we know, as you've just witnessed, that demand is much higher than supply. The demand for care is greater than the supply we have. That's why we have up to 6 months to get to a specialist. We know, and we will get back to this, that this has a severe negative impact on patient well-being. We firmly believe that AI has the potential to address this issue. We also know that access to data is a prerequisite for this success. And at the same time, we have this duality between governments and industry on who is to innovate and who owns the data and what is the regulatory space that we are operating in. That's the topic of this first section. And I want to start out with you, Michael, because you can maybe tell us a bit about to what extent suboptimal interaction with your doctor, your healthcare professional, what impact that has on your well-being.
Yes, so basically we, as you said in the beginning, we have studied people living with psoriasis for 2 years now. We have a sample of more than 100,000 people in our study from around the world. Currently, I think we have 21 countries that are populations that are representative for their country, and that makes it possible to basically test what predicts well-being for this patient group. What we find, just to kind of set the scene, what we find is that it has a huge impact on people's well-being. Living with psoriasis, in many cases, we then test whether it's due to your social well-being, due to loneliness, due to your interactions with your HCP, how your physical condition affects your well-being, comorbidities. We look into and then we look into mental disorders or mental indicators that you have poor mental health, basically. What we find is that one of the drivers, so to say, of the happiness penalty for people living with psoriasis is a weak conversation with the healthcare professional. So not weak in the sense that it's like we are blaming anyone here, but weak in the sense that it's we are not capturing, the conversations are not capturing, in many cases, what's actually important for people, which is addressing the fact that psoriasis is also something that affects well-being. So we've asked people to which extent they agree that their healthcare professional addresses this, or this is addressed in the consultations, that it takes a toll on well-being, and it's about 50% who say that their healthcare professional acknowledges that it's actually there's a mental health component in this physical condition. But it's only 23% who say that it's actually something that's taken up. And we find that the happiness penalties from being one of those who feel that he's acknowledged, that it's acknowledged, is non-significant. So it means the people who are the psoriasis patients who feel that their healthcare professional understands that it's also a mental thing, they don't experience any significant happiness penalty. Whereas the people who do not feel that their healthcare professional acknowledges that this is an issue, they experience a very large and significant happiness penalty. So that's why I feel and I think that technology. So we've been talking just before also about how technology and AI can help patients engage and manage their disease better, but there is this mental health component that is of crucial importance as well, that is maybe sometimes left out on this technology. And I think the technology is able to address this issue as well. I think we are able to not sure exactly how. I have suggestions, but to how we can use the technology to ease in the conversations, but also to guide the healthcare professionals to basically prioritize what needs to be addressed in the conversations.
And really, to make those claims, you need a bunch of data, right?
Yeah.
So Thomas, you're the AI professor. Why does everyone talk about data when we talk about deep learning and these models, and why is that?
Yeah, so as we saw in the example with diagnosing psoriasis, right? It works that by an algorithm that is trained on data, so it needs examples of skin diseases, right? This is the only way that it can learn, and actually. Many years ago, like in the 80s, people were trying to do medical diagnosis, not using so much existing data, but trying to come up with rules So more like taking the expert knowledge of actual practitioners and form that into a rule-based system that would then be able to give diagnosis. And a lot of researchers and people in the medical system worked really hard on this and believed in this. But it never really flew, and it never got very good. And now what we have been seeing over the last at least 10 years is a new and very powerful trend based on machine learning and deep learning. And but the thing is then that these systems need a lot of data, and also we get into these black box problems that we might discuss a bit later, that it can be difficult to understand exactly what goes on inside the system.
What happens if we don't have enough data?
Yeah, so if we don't have enough data, as also it was mentioned in the talk, right, that for this ringworm disease, you didn't have enough examples of that to be able to categorize it correctly in all cases, right? And that goes for anything. So it also goes for if you want to make a driverless car. We have had some spectacular accidents with driverless cars, and all of them were cases in which something happened in front of the car that was different from what it had been trained on. So all of these accidents are examples where the system misclassified or were not able at all to classify what it was seeing, and then there has been some fatal catastrophes with that. So but it works well with something as, let's say, as well delimited as psoriasis, because it's a fairly it's a fairly reasonable pattern to be able to recognize. But of course, the more generally we want to make this, now we want to be able to recognize all skin diseases, or we want to have a driverless car that can drive anywhere in the world, or we want to have a medical diagnosis system that can diagnose for any disease. And then all of a sudden we need data from all situations that have ever occurred, and these systems are yet not as good as humans to learn from data. Humans can learn very quickly. So if you see a lion in the savannah or something, and even if you haven't seen a lion ever before in your life, you pretty much know it's a good idea to run away. And this is not what we have with these systems that yet. They really need enormous amounts of data to work well. And of course, as you said in the beginning with the regulatory space, of course, there comes a tension, right? Because we want to have these good algorithms and good systems that can help us to have better health, but it might imply that we have to give away a lot of data, or at least these systems need a lot of data, and then we have to also decide what about our privacy, anonymity, what about all the data, and are we going to be tracked, all of us?
And I'm so happy we have a politician here. Because you formed the regulatory space, Lisbeth, along with your colleagues, of course, and with the EU regulations and all that. So do we have a favorable regulatory environment for granting access to data and thereby giving the ability to build these models?
No. And the reason why we haven't got like optimal situation is that unfortunately not enough politicians does really understand, or more importantly are interested in these things. Too few are, and many also regard it as a technical issue. So we rely on people like Thomas, or people in like IT people, programmers, and so on, and depolitize the discussion in that sense. But it's filled with really exciting ethical dilemmas, and there's a big difference on what kind of society we get compared to what kind of regulation we decide. And even if we have too much regulation or too little or unwise regulation, because this is not an easy fix. Because as Thomas says, we'll get a lot of much better products if we have a lot of data. But what happens if we do that without smart regulation, then we have problems protecting people's right to privacy if we don't do it the right way. What about surveillance? What about how we regard data as the new capital? Who does it belong to? Does it belong to society as a whole, or the individual, or the company that are making the products based on the data? So all these very important questions we need to
and today, like some public data is given away or made available to companies, but it seems to be in a sort of ad hoc manner. And I mean, if you look at the big 5 tech companies, right, they are building on having collected data for years and years, and that's their claim to fame.
Yeah.
And so is there any strategy for who the government should be providing it to, or how does this go on today?
There's not a clear-cut strategy, but there's definitely from the current government and administration, they want to make more public data or data from people living in this country available for companies for all kind of good reasons, like new products, new cures, research, and so on. But I feel we are lacking the basic discussion about who owns the data, whose property is it? Is it fair that perhaps data that could be critical to our infrastructure or to the well-being of a country or to cure diseases are being monopolized by certain private companies? So it's those discussions that I think we need to have more focus on in the parliament to gain the right balance.
And one of the things, if you talk to technical people, like the unique thing about Denmark is that back in the 60s, someone came up with the CPR system. And that way of having a number that uniquely identifies every single person in the country associated with their medical history is a treasure trove of data. It's on par with any other nation. And one of the things, so Thomas, you talk about the need in the deep learning. What about in your work, Michael? You're studying like basically how miserable are people? Would like, okay, it's not the miserable Research Institute, but that's
Almost.
a branding issue, right? Could you use this data? Could you use access to health information to make better, to better understand patients?
Oh, I'm sure. Like, and I would love to get access to it, but there's of course all the ethical considerations there. But it's there's no doubt that a lot of information, a lot of health information on patients will be useful also for the patient. Like, and that's kind of what I touched upon before. I think there's this mental health component to physical conditions, especially psoriasis. That's what we learned basically. So we could, you could imagine a scenario where we built a compulsory survey that you were to fill out, or you were to before you went to see your HCP, your dermatologist, or your doctor, and that would, if everybody did that, and we had access to this kind of data, we could build some machine learning. I'm sure that can, based on all the data, all of a sudden could start to make some very good predictions of the mental state of this patient. Something that would perhaps not be brought up in the meeting, at the visit between the patient and the doctor, right? But it would guide the HCP all of a sudden to maybe bring this up in the conversation if he had access to this kind of information, and if we had access to it, we could analyze in all sorts of ways as well. So there's of course some issues related to that, and it could then be benchmarked to their medical history, and we can use it. That's for sure.
Lisbeth, you want it?
Yeah, it's just we all know what great benefits we can get from this pool of data, and it's something that could improve the lives of so many people a lot. My mom, she died very young of heart issues. My dad now have serious heart issues, so it's one area of the health sector that I'm very interested in. And there's so many things that we could improve, but I'm afraid that if we are not very careful and protecting people's basic right, which I think is fundamental, the right to privacy and so forth, I'm afraid that we'll get like a techlash where people suddenly will say, I don't want my data being used for anything, I don't believe you when you say it's anonymized, and so on. So if you view the data as a public good that we can all really benefit from, then you also need to have the public's trust that it's not going to backfire. And that's why I think it's so important that we build on from GDPR, which is not perfect, and we make a framework where people feel very safe, because otherwise they don't, and I don't, want the most, private or sensible data being used. And then we are going to miss out on a very big and great future in healthcare.
We also have a system in Denmark where innovation typically comes from industry. And as you already had an idea on how we could start to collect data, right? And use that, for good things, right? Mm. But it's hard to get into that space. But will we ever have people? I mean, how do we avoid the tech lash, as you say? If when I ask, what are the rules for who gets access today, and there's no clear answer from politicians on this?
I think at least you have to start by not to be too critical of the current government, but I think we need to stay clear of situations where, for example, the Danish people here in this room have heard about this thing that school children have to fill out. How happy are you? How do you feel? How is it going in school? How are your parents? And so forth. And there was this scandal that they thought they were being anonymous, and really they weren't. And there were a lot of school children down to the age of 7, 8 years who suddenly filled out the form saying, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. And that's the reaction you get from children that understand that if their information is not safe, they don't want to answer these things correctly and truthfully, even though it could give us a very good and useful image about how the mental state of school children in Denmark is. So they understand it. And that's why I say we need to make a framework where we really take good care of the sensible data of people, because otherwise we don't get the rewards of the big data. We don't need to know specific things about each other. We need to see the patterns and the big things, we need more self-discipline and restriction as politicians, and not to cross-register data about people in this country, because then they feel surveillanced by the state, I'm afraid.
We'll get back to that a bit later. Thomas, I had a question for you, but you want to make a point?
Yeah, so the thing is, I mean, if you want to really get as much information out of the data as possible, right, then actually you want to have all data about one person in one place, right? And then you actually want all these different registers to be integrated, right? Because in principle there could be things that affect your heart health or something that you didn't really think about, right? So the more data you have, the more patterns can you find, right? Mm. So there might be, for instance, it might turn out that there's some pollution somewhere that some people didn't know about, right? But then you correlate where people live with a certain rare disease or something, and you see, oh, there's something wrong here. All people living in this area have this rare disease, so maybe we should look into that. The problem is then that if you do that and you really integrate all the data for everybody, then making it anonymous and ensuring that we only look at the big picture becomes extremely difficult, right? And so there's also a purely technical problem in here, right? That I totally agree with your point, but it's also, we know that it's a real struggle, right? Because ideally then all the data should just be open source but anonymized. And then any company, startup companies that want to find new patterns, they can find the data, and it's a treasure chest of nice things. But the problem is that it's really difficult to make sure that it's really anonymous, and you cannot use the same type of algorithms to actually backtrack and figure out who these people are. So that's, yeah.
Yeah, and I want to then move on to the second bit here on the slides, and we chose the title, Adopting the Black Box. And so for instance, like how do we bring about adopting AI into healthcare? We are seeing this as an assistance tool, what we want to develop here, right? So it's like a free of charge second opinion, per se. That sounds pretty cool, right? We need data for it, and we think we can get there. So in not collecting the data, we are also at least subject to think about the ethics of not doing this if we were actually able to help people, right? There is also an ethical aspect of not acting. So let's say now that some company comes and claims that they have an AI that outperforms or at least compares to expert level of ability. Then like, should we then just adopt it? We can save money. We could spend that on whatever political priorities you have. We could put into research, who knows? For you, Thomas, isn't there something here that in not going about collecting this data, adopting these technologies, that we're also missing out or have a responsibility? I'm going with Lisbeth because I'm like the critical. No. Yes, that's why I start by saying there are some really great and interesting and very difficult dilemmas in all of this, because wherever you restrict yourself from using something that's available, then you miss out on something that perhaps could be of great benefit for the individual or for the society as a whole. So there's a price to pay no matter what you do. I think that AI, especially in healthcare, could be a tremendous gift. The more we know, it can see patterns and help cure or observe new diseases. But when talking about the black box issues, I think it's unacceptable to just say the black box is a big mystery to us and for the people who created it, and we have to live with that because the benefits are are great. I think we have to continuously trying to understand. And that in the process makes us smarter as well, trying to understand the AI and not just saying we don't understand what's going on. And also AI are continuously being improved. There's this well-known example of an AI that in the US should determine when patients with pneumonia should be sent home from hospital. And the AI sent the pneumonia patients with asthma home first, even though they were most at risk. And it did it because it could see the data that the pneumonia patients were, when they were hospitalized, they were put in extra care because they were more at risk. And that meant they recovered from pneumonia faster than people with no asthma. You know what I mean? But that was just a case of it not recognizing that they were taking extra good care of because they had asthma and pneumonia at the same time. And it sort of attacks my when I say outperform, right? That can be hard to quantify. And the numbers you heard from Adrian before, they were about this thing, what's in the picture, right? But Michael, where you work, you are looking maybe more at what people are saying, right? It's patient-reported outcomes. were you happy with your HCP, your healthcare professional, right? How do you deal with objective versus subjective in terms of performance, or what you should attribute, like the quality of the data, what matters?
Well, I think it's so specifically for this kind of technology that can identify which kind of skin disease, and probably also the severity. Is it mild or moderate or severe psoriasis, so on? It's important. I think this kind of technology is brilliant, and I don't think anybody disagree with that. But there is a difference between like the objective measures and the subjective measures. We know that people who report to have mild psoriasis, like people who are clinically diagnosed with mild psoriasis, for instance, they could report themselves to perceive their psoriasis to be severe, and that self-perceived severity could be a better indicator, perhaps, of their mental state, and that's important, right? It's just perhaps more important for some perspective, you could say. Of course, if we're looking at it positivistically and we want to have the clinical diagnosis, of course, listen to the doctor, the machine, whatever, but people's experience of their disease is equally important, and perhaps even more, because that's what they experience. So if we leave out, so I think my point is we know that mental health and physical health are strongly linked together, and you can never omit mental health in the health equation. And to do so is basically to at least for the patient perspective, right? And to do so is to leave out the most potent source of misery. So I think that should be reflected in this kind of technology. I think we need to consider how we can complement this kind of technology with technology that takes into account how people actually experience their life and the more subjective perspective on this kind of these kind of assessments.
One of the things that is mentioned, and is also part of the title, is the notion of explainability. Like, what's the reasoning here? Thomas, we've talked about this, and you said, well, maybe if I go to my doctor and she speaks Latin, but she's the best damn doctor in the world, that would be fine. I don't understand a word, but I get the best care in the world, right? And maybe we should accept that. As you say, we should look at comfort. Could we technically, Thomas, define explainability?
Right. Okay. So yeah. So the thing is, as you started out to say, okay. So what if we have some AI that outperforms human doctors? It could be as a general practitioner, or it could be in a limited area, right? So that's kind of the outset, and then we can discuss what outperform means. But we could just quantitatively say, okay, outperform in this case means that the AI makes more correct diagnosis statistically than the human, right? So that's outperforming in making correct diagnosis. And now the question is then the AI that makes more correct diagnosis, is that then, let's say, objectively or in practice better or not? And then there's a lot of things that makes this a bit complicated, right? Because it's also a matter of trust. So it's not only a matter of who is more correct or who makes the most right decisions. It's also a matter of trust. We have trust in companies, we have trust in human beings, we have trust in technology, also like driverless cars. So driverless cars can, objectively speaking, be safer because they make less accidents, but we might still feel less safe in those cars because we know of some spectacular fatal accidents, and we don't know when these accidents can happen. So the example with the doctor who speaks Latin was to kind of give an example of a doctor that in a sense is a bit like what a lot of AI is today. So you might get the right diagnosis, but the doctor uses all these Latin terms that ordinary people don't understand. So the doctor speaks as she would do to fellow doctors, right? And that could actually also, if that happened to me, it would probably also make me trust less. It's not only about how often the doctor makes the correct or incorrect diagnosis. So let's say my doctor makes an incorrect diagnosis at some point. I go back to the doctor and say, okay, but this was not the right diagnosis. And then the doctor says, oh, no, I'm very sorry, I misread this number, or I actually thought I looked at it, and you had the combination of these two symptoms, and then the most common disease based on these symptoms is this. But in rare cases, it could be that, and I didn't see that, right? And then that could reestablish my trust in that doctor, right? Otherwise, I might go to another doctor. If that doctor just keeps on speaking in Latin, I'll say, okay, I'm done with you. So, and you said about explainability, I can see that you're trying to, to stop me.
I wanted to know if you could define it.
But you wanted me to define it, yeah. So the thing is, well, trust comes from not that our fellow human beings are flawless, because nobody is flawless, but trust comes from people being able to explain their reasoning and what is behind their reasoning in a way that we can understand. So for a doctor, it means explaining things in a language that I can understand. So the algorithm should have some degree of explainability, where the algorithm, I mean, this is where we should be heading, and this is also where a lot of research is heading, that these algorithms are not just black boxes, but can start to be more, have a better ability of explaining themselves to human beings. And of course, can I define it? No, but I can just say that right now, in terms of explainability, then these machine learning algorithms and human beings are extremely far apart. And even if they are better, statistically speaking, at doing diagnosis, then that might not mean that we trust them more and like them more. So we have to, this is a trade-off, right? If we can get a bit more explainability and we understand them better, we will also trust them more, and we will not be so skeptical. And then they can outperform also in terms of mental health and happiness, because again, it's also about feeling safe and secure and feeling that you're being taken care of.
Yeah, yeah. And Lisbeth, you wanted to make a point?
No, I just, there's a lot of researchers around the world that are trying to engineer predictability, or trying to see what's going on inside the black box. This is one of the Google researchers, Maya Gupta, has made a project called Glass Box, where you're trying to understand the different steps. So it's just, there's a lot going on to try to see, and also using AI to try to make us understanding AI, right? But we often put it like either we have an AI doctor or we have a human doctor, and what do we trust more? And we know that the best result is coming from combining these two, and especially, a doctor can also be tired or angry or racist or annoyed or whatever that day. So it's not like there's no bias in humans, but at least there's somebody who is responsible. And I'm just afraid that if we have blind trust in AI that we don't understand, and we can't justify why they're doing as they do, then there's nobody responsible, really. So the combination of the two is, a big positive step forward.
Cool. That we're gonna stop here, but that's some good suggestions for how we might want to adopt this black box. So the last bit we'll move into is talking a bit about the future. We've already touched upon these things, and then we'll go into questions from the audience. We talked about, and I'm going to interrupt you maybe a bit sooner, but Lisbeth, do you as politicians have the tools, councils, departments, technical people at your disposal to deal with some of the dilemmas we touched upon, and make sure that all of the considerations you have and other politicians have on where we should go are actually technically sound, right? We have an economic council, for instance, and we have something similar. What in your toolbox can you pull out to actually affect or change these things?
Luckily, there's a world outside of Christiansborg, the parliament. People sometimes in there forget that, but there is, and it's a really good thing, because we can talk to people like Thomas or many of the people who work with these issues and are very knowledgeable about that, because we don't have the resources in parliament. We don't have our own committee. We don't have a minister just dealing with these things. We don't have the financial resources to it, and there's not enough political interest, even though it's gained more interest the last couple of years. There's still not enough. But luckily there's a lot of people and institutions and NGOs and so forth, and a tech festival, where there's so much knowledge helping us if we're just looking for it and asking for it. But we need, like the role of the parliament is to control the government, and we don't have the resources to do it when they come with some legislation or a bill or something. So we take it outside to the civil society or wherever, and are asking like, what are the implications of
yes or
of
no?
this?
Is that good enough?
I think we should also have some tools in the parliament. Of course, the interaction is really good, but we need people who really understand the depth of the things we're doing, because it's in these years that we're laying the foundation and the legislation for how to deal with, like, the Genome Center, or how to deal with data protection and so forth. So it's like we're paving a road right now, and we have to do it right. And there's not enough interest or resources right now.
And one of the things you could be discussing were some of these ethical dilemmas which touched upon here, right? And Michael, you know the data, and you know, like, I'm sure you could give me 8 questions, and you would like know my entire family history or something. What are some of the, when we look to the futures, what do we risk here?
So I think like the initial or the current ethical concerns, or many of which those that Lisbeth have just touched upon, like the privacy and the democratization ethics issues, and these are the ones we are. There's more, but those are the ones that we are concerned with now. Because this field is emerging, and these are the things we need to deal with and have a discussion about and debate about. Hypothetically, if we solve these problems in a good way, we will, and of course AI and machine learning will just emerge and become a bigger part of our life. I think the ethical consideration, the ethical concern that will rise, and we will discuss more in the future, would be the question on paternalism. So basically, paternalism is whenever an authority makes an intervention or interfere with our autonomy as a person, as a patient, or whatever. And this is basically a question or an issue every time we make something compulsory, right? So to take the example, my own example, with starting to assess the mental health of patients through a survey that's then benchmark all the patients' results with a database and health registers and etc., and makes a really good prediction on the mental state of the patient, which the doctor then can use to decide whether we need to make this a topic in the consultation, right? This paternalism becomes the problem here, because what if the patients don't want to be assessed by a machine, right? So should we then make it? Should we, even though we know it's better for them, even though the machine can perhaps predict outcomes that the patient not even aware of, and hypothetically, it will do so. And then there's the autonomy consideration, really, the paternalism consideration, and I think it's one that will emerge, and I think it's
yeah, and you're setting up the risk of an Orwellian society, right? Everyone's going to be watching, we're going to know everything, right? But I have a technical background, and I sort of don't hate the algorithms, hate the data, and I want to end on something, Thomas, on the bias that we know exists in the data, and like, what should we think about going forward with what this data means and how it's interpreted?
Right.
And you have 2 minutes.
Yeah, I have 2 minutes. Good. I also wanted to address what Lisbeth said, but anyway, yeah. No, okay. So the thing is, of course, that when we talk about the ethical issues with data or with algorithms that process data, then we can design algorithms that are purely objective, and they're doing complicated mathematical calculations, right? But they're not biased by the designers, but of course what they decide to do will be affected by the data, and they might see some patterns that we would like not to react on. So this is what we have seen, for instance, with the system in the States, where they wanted to make a machine learning-based system to decide whether criminals should be allowed to go on parole or not, and where they found out that there was a racial bias, so the system overrated the risk that black people would commit new crime, and this is, of course, we don't want to say that, okay, because you're black you cannot go on parole. That would be racist, right? So there's something about what we do when we have an algorithm where we just feed with all the data we have, and we get a decision, but we might not have a clear view of what parameters had actually then been used in that decision. And I think all these problems are solvable, right? So it's not, I'm not trying to sort of go against the use of AI, but it just means, of course, that there are some issues that are still somehow a bit unsolved. And if I may, just to address a bit what Lisbeth said, that about regulating this stuff, right? It's one of the problems is that it's so difficult. It's not easy, right? If we talk about, okay, should we allow higher speed limits on the highways in Denmark, then you can do some analysis and statistics, and you can say how many more people will get killed, and what is the value of a human life versus what is the value of getting home as fast as possible. And then a politician can say, oh, but I think this is more valuable than that, and then you set the speed limit a bit higher or a bit lower. But with AI, it's so much more complicated, right? And this is why, and we need these dialogues, of course, because it's not as simple as that. And that means that we have to make decision and regulate in something that is far more complicated. And you can see there's all these stories about Sophia, the robot that now is an inhabitant in Saudi Arabia, and there was a story about Facebook robots that went amok, and they had to close down the experiment because these robots went crazy. And this is how some of these stories are presented in media, and it's something else that is going on, that how it's represented in media. But to explain what is going on is rather complicated, right? It's not something you can do in 1 minute, 30 seconds, 5 seconds.
Yeah.
But of course we will get there, right? But we just need to understand that this is a technology which is far more complicated than most of the other technologies we have introduced in history.
Thank you all for some very interesting comments. Please give a hand to our panelists. We will be taking questions from the audience now. Please state your name and where you're coming from.
My name is Hossam. I come from Egypt, but
I meant company, but.
Okay, so I'm a little bit curious about the legislation. Why do you think it's complicated, while maybe every single one of us here have a very complicated tracking device, which we call a phone, and all our data is sent to some companies in another country, and it's tracking where you go, tracking your friends, tracking your pictures, tracking your where you have holidays, and it has access to your medical information, it has access to your banks, and all this is already collected, and all this we already know that it have been collected, and we already know that the implications that it was collected and how it was not totally secure. So I would like to know why is it so difficult to actually.
Who would you like to ask?
Yeah, so I would like to know why is it so difficult to have legislation for medical data, and that why is it so different that something like a phone, for example? And I think the phone is a lot more dangerous than medical data.
Was that a question for me? Actually, I don't always think that it's difficult with legislation. In some areas it is. But first of all, you should always make legislation out of some guiding principles and then try to make it very concrete. And if you find that the right to privacy supersedes completely access to everything, because there's a lot of good things you can do with all people's massive amounts of data, then that's the balance, right? If I understand your question correctly, it's like you say, private companies, big tech, they can do a lot of things, but with the public data, we try to regulate it, or but it's already the case that a lot of our health data is given away to private companies for research reasons, right? I'm not happy with the regulation right now post GDPR, which was one of the steps to try to regulate the data flows. Another thing is that there's a lot of legislation for the analog world, which we haven't translated for the digital world. So the weird thing is that we have things that are illegal in the real analog world, but are not really regulated or being taken into effect in the digital world. One example is like political commercials or ads. Another example is the use of registers. It's not legal in Denmark to register somebody as a person from the northern part of Jutland, gay, Jew, voting for the Liberal Alliance. It's not illegal to have that register, but you have it de facto online because of the data from social media. So it's also because there's a lack of understanding how to translate the legislation from the analog world to the digital world, and saying the principles are the same and the considerations are the same. I hope that made sense.
Thank you for the question.
I would like to talk about accountability. My name is Michael Jan from Politiken, Danish newspaper. Accountability. Now we started to talk about psoriasis, and I don't know how much bad you can do with a wrong diagnosis of psoriasis. But let's talk about cancer, for example. That can be really hard if it's the wrong diagnosis. Who is responsible for the algorithms? Is it the company who made it, the researchers who made the research behind it, or is it the doctor who used it, or the hospital who followed it? That is my big problem, that I'm not so much afraid about the data. Well, I am, in a way, but I'm more afraid of not knowing who is accountable. And just to, if I can just add a little bit on it, recently I was talking to an American researcher about racist algorithms. When she was searching on black girls, she got a lot of naughty stuff at the time, and she confronted Google and said, how can that happen? And Google would never tell her about who was responsible. They corrected it immediately, but who was responsible for it? How could it happen? What was wrong in their system, since I came to the wrong conclusions? So there's so many things where I do not know how do we set up a system to solve that, and who should do it.
Thomas, would you take a stab at accountability?
Yeah, I can try. Yeah, so it is indeed it is very complicated. So, but I mean, we can take one of the examples is with the medical diagnosis, and this is complicated, right? Because normally people would say there has to be a human in the loop. So it's not only an AI system. There should also, if it's a general diagnosis system, there should also be a real doctor who looks at what the system proposes, right? And of course, that doctor has some responsibility because so that doctor could get, let's say, good advice, correct advice, and decide to ignore it. So if in case you do that, that's a bit like deciding to ignore some medical knowledge or research, right? So you could say that a doctor decides to ignore everything that happened in medicine within the last 100 years. So that guy only wants to look at things that were medical equipment and medical books that are at least 100 years old. And of course we say, okay, but that person will be responsible for not using the latest technology and the latest knowledge. So we somehow, that doctor should in a sense be responsible for making sure to take good advice from a good AI algorithm. But what if that person gets bad advice? And then somehow, well, we would normally say that doctor still has to be responsible, right? Because if there is something that looks like cancer and the system recommends to take some painkillers, then that's clearly something wrong, right? So I would say that well, by default, I would say it's the doctor, and this is why we need the human in the loop. But on the other hand, it becomes more complicated when we can say, okay, but there might be different companies on the market having these kind of systems, and they might have different levels of precision, right? And so what are the conditions we have to pose on them? So we might risk the same situation with driverless cars, that at some point there will be a lot of companies that develop driverless cars, and some might be very high quality and some are maybe not so high quality, but how do we test and approve these systems? And this is the same as for other types of medical equipment, right? We need to know, we need to do research into how good and precise are they, right? So that's something that of course those who make the product also has some responsibility, but that should be also based on that they promise that this system is so and so good, or yeah. So so it will be maybe a bit of a shared responsibility.
But you're sort of saying it's never the machine that can be responsible.
No, okay, yeah, no, you did, but I don't think you even proposed that. No, but never this machine. No, no.
Hi, Adrian from Hospitalen. I wanted to ask, because since we are talking about AI and healthcare, I see a misrepresentation of healthcare practitioners and medical doctors, not in my case, but also, do you think it's important to bring in them into the conversation of how to apply AI in health, since they already have the data or access to it, and also they can provide how to interpret these models in medical terms, in those Latins, at least for the regulation, because they could say, okay, this model is performing properly.
Yeah. Who are you asking?
In general.
Yes. Yes. And for many reasons, but you cannot validate the system. And the best we know about diagnosis is what the best experts in the world know about diagnosis, right? You cannot make a system without including the experts. And I think you also need to make systems that enhance the experts rather than, as we talked, as some are sometimes suggesting, replacing them, right? Yes, you need the most expert of expert people to label this data for it to work and for it to be clinically sound. And then, of course, it sort of goes to what Thomas was talking about. Can we set any rules for that and regulations for when that is good enough?
Okay.
I don't have a good definition of that, but you need the experts in this conversation as the centerpiece.
Thank
you. Can I just add really quickly, like, if I'm ill and my doctor gives me some medicine, I trust that the medicine is it's certified, it's approved, the doctor knows what's in it and have given me the receipt because it's the best choice, right? And I take it because there's some trust that it's the right medicine, even though it could be like a drug that killed me. I don't know. If I don't have any trust in any people or in doctors, that would be a crazy thing to trust somebody with. But we have all these layers of trust, and also where there's a system where you can, there's like control mechanisms. So somebody is like watching over the doctors, are they, corrupt or whatever? But there's also always the element of trust. You also look to the agency that puts the approval stamp on. Are they corrupt? would they approve medicine that would kill people? So obviously in a country where it's better the more trust you have, but it's also good that you have institutions where there's like control mechanisms, so you put stuff in your body that could kill you, but you trust that it won't, it will actually make you healthy. And the same goes, I think, with AI. You should have some mechanisms so you can know, okay, this AI, the advice that it gives, it's very important for the person, for the patient, that it's correct. So you need some kind of approval stamp, or you need an institution that says, if the healthcare system in Denmark are using this, we need experts to like put an approval stamp on that you can use this system. And for that, it's important that you have, that you can backtrack and kind of, you know, control that it is a safe instrument to use. And I think that it's not easy to do, but some of the principles are the same, you know.
And we are going to have to stop here, unfortunately.
Sorry.
Super interesting. and yeah, one of the questions I'm just going to leave you with was, do we need some way to appeal these decisions by algorithms, right? We have that for doctors. If a doctor does bad, we can appeal it. We don't have a system in place for appealing decisions made by algorithms. Should we have that? We can't get to that. Thank you all for wanting to participate. Please give them a round of applause.